It all began in a quiet pharmacy. Just another typical night, or so it appeared. A hardworking black woman walked in, exhausted after a long shift, simply trying to pick up her prescription. But when a minor error escalated into suspicion and two crooked cops arrived, ready to make an example out of her, the situation turned dark and ugly. They assumed they could degrade her, set her up, and strip away her dignity without hesitation. What they didn't realize was, she wasn't alone, and the storm she was about to release would rip through everything they believed they had power over. Stay tuned, because the twists ahead are more intense than anyone could predict. And tell us, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your story too. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night. Gloria Tate, a 58-year-old nurse who had spent the last 3 decades patching wounds and comforting hurting souls, was finally clocking out after a punishing double shift. Her feet ached. Her back was stiff from endless hours on her feet, but all she could think about was grabbing her refill before heading home. The Georgia air was still hot, thick, and sticky, even though the sun had disappeared hours ago. It was the kind of night where even the breeze felt sluggish. The local pharmacy sat at the edge of a quiet suburban strip mall, mostly shut down now, except for the pale yellow glow spilling from its windows. Gloria pulled her aging sedan into a space beneath the one flickering streetlight, grabbed her purse, and made her way inside. She moved with that slow, careful grace unique to nurses, carrying a quiet dignity, even when her body screamed for rest. Inside, the store was nearly empty. A teenage clerk slouched behind the counter, yawning and tapping lazily at his phone. Gloria gave him a polite nod and handed over her ID, insurance card, and the small prescription slip her doctor had written for her blood pressure medication. It was a straightforward routine. She had been filling prescriptions here for years. The kid barely looked at her as he scanned the documents, typing distractedly on the register. The minutes dragged on. Gloria shifted from foot to foot, watching as the boy frowned at the screen, squinting. Then he leaned in and muttered something to the store manager, a tight-lipped white woman in her 40s with a sour expression, like she'd just smelled something unpleasant. The woman glanced at Gloria, then looked again, her lips pressed tighter. She tapped something on the screen and whispered back to the clerk. Gloria couldn't hear what they were saying, but the air in the room shifted, subtle, yet unmistakable, and she felt it instantly, that invisible, suffocating pressure. She knew this feeling. Every black person knew it. When doubt entered the room before a single word had been said. Finally, the manager stepped forward. Her smile was forced, her voice overly sweet. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's a problem with your prescription." Gloria raised an eyebrow, confused but composed. "A problem? I've been picking up this same medication here for years." The woman's hands fidgeted nervously. "The account details, they don't match. I'm afraid we can't process this tonight." Gloria leaned in, calm but firm. "That can't be right. You have my ID, my insurance card. Everything checks out. Please double-check." But the woman was already retreating, her posture stiffening. "I'm going to have to ask you to stay here, ma'am. We've contacted the authorities to look into the matter." For a moment, Gloria thought she had misheard. "Authorities?" she repeated, her voice dangerously even. The boy behind the counter suddenly looked like he wished he could disappear. He wouldn't meet her gaze. The manager lifted her chin slightly, the way people do when they've already judged you. Gloria took a long, deep breath. Years in emergency rooms had trained her to stay composed when the pressure rose. But this was something colder, something older. It wasn't poor service. It was the age-old stench of being labeled guilty by the color of your skin before saying a word. Outside, the faint whine of sirens drifted through the heavy night air. Gloria held her ground. She could have walked out, demanded her paperwork back and left. But that would have looked suspicious, and she had done nothing wrong. No. Tonight she would stand and wait. Moments later, the door chimed sharply as 2 police officers entered, both white, both wearing that easy, entitled confidence that expected the room to rearrange itself around them. The first was tall and broad, with a buzz cut and a slight smirk tugging at his lip. The second was slimmer, younger, and lingered just a step behind, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to enjoy what was about to happen. Gloria caught their look. It wasn't curiosity. It was assumption. The manager rushed toward them, dropping her voice to an urgent whisper. "That's her," she said. "She tried to pick up medication under someone else's account. The information doesn't match. I think she's using fraudulent insurance." The first officer didn't glance at the screen, didn't ask to see any documents. He squared his shoulders and stepped toward Gloria like a lion stalking wounded prey. "Ma'am," he said, his tone thick with condescension, "I'm going to need you to step outside." Gloria stood tall. "I haven't done anything wrong." The younger officer shifted uneasily but said nothing. The manager crossed her arms, watching with a glimmer of satisfaction. The first officer's hand moved to his belt. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The threat was barely veiled. Other customers in the pharmacy began to glance over. A mother grabbed her child's hand and hurried off, while a man near the cold medicine aisle pulled out his phone and began recording. Gloria caught the slight movement from the corner of her eye. Good, let them record. Still, she felt that familiar heat rising in her chest. A tight knot of anger and humiliation twisted together. After all she had done in her life, saving lives, comforting the dying, working double shifts through pandemics, this was how she was treated. Like a criminal, like a danger, because of the color of her skin. Gloria forced herself to breathe deeply and slowly. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained calm. "I have my ID, my insurance, and proof this prescription is mine," she said evenly, holding up the documents. The officer barely glanced at them. "Step outside." When she didn't move immediately, he stepped forward, grabbing her wrist roughly. Gasps rippled through the pharmacy. Gloria didn't fight back. Fighting would give them the excuse they wanted. Instead, she allowed herself to be let out, head held high, as the cold metal of the handcuffs pressed sharply into her skin. She could hear murmurs, feel the dozens of eyes on her. Even through the growing blur of emotion, she saw the small, victorious smirk on the manager's face. But she didn't look away, not from the manager, not from the officers as they shoved her into the back of the squad car. Gloria met the officer's eyes and said in a voice as steady as steel, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The door slammed shut, sealing her in, and somewhere deep inside her chest, past the hurt and humiliation, a small, cold flame began to burn. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Not yet, but they would. And when the reckoning came, it would be swift, brutal, and leave a mark they'd never forget. The ride to the station was silent, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that made you breathe easier. It was the kind that pressed down on your chest, making the air feel heavier with each passing mile. Gloria sat rigidly in the back seat, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, the cold metal digging into her bones. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She knew that in their minds, silence could be twisted into guilt, but no explanation she gave would change what they had already decided about her. The officers in the front, Officer Rick Coleman driving, Officer David Miller riding shotgun, spoke to each other in low, casual voices, as if she wasn't even there, as if she were just a package to be filed away before they grabbed a late-night coffee. Coleman chuckled at something Miller said, shaking his head. "Another fraud case. What is it with these people thinking they can just walk in and take whatever they want?" His voice was low, but Gloria heard every word. Miller mumbled something back, less distinct, less sure, but didn't disagree. Gloria stared out the window as the lights of Savannah blurred past her, her jaw tight, every muscle in her body screaming to fight back, to demand they see her. But she knew better. She had seen too many people who didn't make it out of that back seat. When they pulled into the small, run-down precinct, Coleman yanked the door open and motioned her out with an impatient flick of his hand. "Let's go. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She climbed out carefully, feeling every pair of eyes in the parking lot burning into her. Other officers stood around, sipping coffee, chatting, pretending not to notice, but they noticed. Gloria could feel their curiosity weighing down on her. Inside the station, it was no better. The walls were painted a sickly off-white, the floor scuffed and stained. The air was filled with the smell of cheap disinfectant and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glare on everything. They led her to the booking desk. Miller fumbled with the cuffs while Coleman filled out a form, scribbling lazily. Name Gloria Tate. Age 58. Race black. That last box, Gloria thought bitterly, was the only one they cared about tonight. Coleman smirked as he pushed the form toward the desk sergeant. Suspected prescription fraud, he said loudly enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. Caught red-handed at the pharmacy. The desk sergeant, a balding man with heavy jowls, glanced at Gloria, then shrugged. Another black woman, another statistic, another night. They took her mugshot, a flash of bright, blinding light, a click that sounded like a door slamming shut, then fingerprinted her, pressing her sore wrists roughly against the ink pad, rolling each finger mechanically like she was already guilty, like there was no point pretending otherwise. Afterward, they walked her toward the holding cells. Gloria's shoes squeaked against the linoleum, each step slow and deliberate as they passed through the station. She caught snippets of conversation. What's she in for? Fraud, I think. Figures. Every comment stung, not because she believed them, but because she knew how easily lies once spoken could take root and become truths in the minds of people who didn't want to know better. They shoved her into a cell, a bare, cold metal bench bolted to the wall, and slammed the door shut with a clang that echoed down the hallway. Coleman leaned against the bars, smirking. You want to tell us the real story now? He asked, his voice mocking. Might go easier for you if you come clean. Gloria met his gaze unflinchingly. The real story is, you're going to regret tonight. Miller snorted from where he leaned against the opposite wall. Yeah, sure. You got a magic lawyer hiding in your purse or something? She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Coleman shrugged. Suit yourself. You can sit here and think it over. They walked away, their heavy boots echoing against the floor, leaving her alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the scent of bleach and defeat. Gloria remained still for a long moment, her hands gently resting in her lap, her breathing slow and measured. Then she turned her wrists, inspecting the red marks the cuffs had left behind. Proof not only of what had happened tonight, but of what they had always been prepared to do, assuming no one would call them out. She shifted slightly, feeling the hard metal bench beneath her, the coldness of the concrete walls. She was tired, bone-tired, but beneath the exhaustion, under the bruises and humiliation, that small flame from earlier still burned steady, fierce. The injustice of it all could have crushed someone else, but not Gloria Tate. She had faced worse, survived worse, and she wasn't alone. The clock above the booking desk ticked loudly. 9:42 p.m. It wouldn't be much longer now. She knew Walter was already in motion. Her father wasn't the kind of man who wasted time. If anything, the injustice of tonight would only push him to move faster, to become even more dangerous. Out in the hallway, voices rose, first low, then louder, followed by the unmistakable crack of a desk being slapped. Coleman's voice echoed down the corridor. What do you mean someone's calling from DC at this hour? A pause. Yeah. Well, tell them they can shove it. Gloria smiled faintly to herself. She recognized that tone. The bravado of a man who knew he had stepped into quicksand but still thought he could walk his way out. The phone rang again, louder this time, longer. Another officer picked it up, and his voice tightened immediately. Yes, sir. She's here. Yes, sir. Right away. Gloria leaned back against the cold concrete wall and closed her eyes for a brief moment. It had begun. They thought they were dealing with just another exhausted black woman too weary to fight back. But what they had actually done was light a match over a pool of gasoline, and now the fire was coming for them. Not in days, not in weeks, but tonight. She opened her eyes and waited, because justice wasn't just a dream for someone like Gloria Tate. It was a storm, and it was almost here. The minutes stretched like hours inside the holding cell. Gloria sat upright on the cold metal bench, her hands resting carefully in her lap. She refused to slouch, refused to show any sign of defeat. If they wanted to humiliate her, they were going to have to try much harder than this. Footsteps echoed down the hallway every few minutes, sometimes heavy boots stomping with purpose, other times the lazy shuffle of someone passing time. None of them stopped at her door. None of them even glanced her way. They didn't need to. In their minds, she was already categorized and forgotten. Just another case number, just another woman who didn't matter. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, casting brief, jerky shadows across the gray walls. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang again. Sharp and urgent, but it was quickly answered and cut off. The tension in the building had shifted. Gloria could feel it, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Officer Coleman swaggered back down the hallway, pretending he wasn't rattled. His smirk was still there but thinner now, like a cracked mask barely holding together. He stopped outside her cell, tapping the metal bars with his knuckles as though knocking on a door. "How you holding up in there, Grandma?" he drawled. Gloria tilted her head slightly, studying him. He wanted a reaction, needed it, but she stayed silent. Coleman shrugged, pretending it didn't bother him. "You know, we could have let you go with just a warning. But now you're looking at real charges. Attempted fraud. Maybe even resisting arrest if we get creative." He grinned wider, but his eyes darted toward the front desk, where officers were whispering more urgently than before. Gloria allowed herself a small, slow smile. "You don't even realize it yet, do you?" she said quietly. Coleman's grin faltered just a fraction. "Realize what?" She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "That the walls are already closing in." Before he could respond, the door to the front of the station banged open hard enough that, even from the holding cell, Gloria could hear it. A different kind of silence swept through the building. One that wasn't about boredom or routine anymore. This silence was full of held breath and darting glances. Gloria remained perfectly still. She didn't need to see him to know who had just entered. Walter Tate, her father, the retired FBI legend whose name still made certain people in law enforcement sit a little straighter, speak a little more carefully. The man who had spent decades pulling corrupt officers out of their safe corners and shining a blinding light into their darkness. And now he was here for her. She heard low voices at the front desk. Not angry, but worse. Calm, controlled. A few "yes, sir" murmured hurriedly. A few officers scattering like leaves in the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moved toward the back of the station. Officer Miller appeared first, peeking around the corner toward the holding cells. His face was pale. His mouth tightened into a thin, nervous line as he whispered something urgently to Coleman, panic in his voice. Coleman snapped back at him, but Gloria could see it now. The fracture in the bravado, the dawning realization. He knew something was wrong, but he had no idea how bad it was going to get. Two men in dark suits and earpieces trailed Miller down the hall. Gloria recognized them immediately. Federal agents, not local cops, not rent-a-cops, the real deal. Behind them walked Walter Tate. He hadn't changed much since his retirement. Perhaps a few more lines on his face, a little more silver in his closely cropped hair, but his posture remained straight, his eyes still sharp, and his presence still commanded the room the way a storm fills the sky. Slow, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. He didn't look at the officers. Instead, his gaze locked onto Gloria. When their eyes met, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. "I'm here. You're not alone. Not this time." Walter turned his attention to Coleman, and the effect was immediate. Coleman straightened, as if back in boot camp, his face flushing a deep defensive red. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded. Walter's voice was calm, deadly calm. The desk sergeant stumbled forward. That would be me, sir." Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Good. Then you'll explain to me why a licensed nurse with valid identification and no criminal record is sitting in a holding cell tonight." The sergeant opened his mouth but closed it again, sweat trickling down his temple. Walter continued, his tone even and merciless. "You'll explain why your officers detained her without verifying her identity, why they ignored clear evidence of who she was, why they physically restrained her in public without probable cause." He took a slow step forward. "And you'll explain it very carefully. Because as of 10 minutes ago, you're not just dealing with local fallout. You're facing a federal civil rights violation, and the Department of Justice is already on the line. Gloria watched as Coleman's face drained from red to a sickly gray, his jaw clenching so tight it looked painful. Walter glanced at the two agents beside him. "Unlock the cell," he ordered. One of the agents retrieved a set of keys and moved to the door. Coleman finally found his voice. "You can't just walk in here." Walter barely turned his head, fixing him with a look that could freeze fire. "I already have," he said. The cell door creaked open, and Walter stepped forward, offering his hand to Gloria. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, every muscle screaming for dignity. She didn't take his hand right away. Instead, she stood on her own 2 feet, back straight, shoulders squared, and then nodded once. Walter's smile was barely perceptible as he stepped aside, allowing her to walk out first. As she passed Coleman, she didn't even glance at him, but she saw how his hands balled into fists at his sides, the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed hard. He knew now, finally, this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And for the first time that night, Gloria allowed herself to exhale. A slow, steady breath that tasted like victory beginning to bloom. As Gloria stepped out of the cell, the entire station seemed to shift around her. Officers who had been standing casually moments ago now found urgent reasons to look anywhere but at her. The ones who had laughed, who had whispered, each stiffened, their postures tight, their faces carefully neutral. Walter walked a step behind her. Not crowding, not pushing. Just there, a silent wall of authority at her back. The 2 federal agents flanked them, making it unmistakably clear that this was no polite request. This was a reckoning, walking through their halls one deliberate step at a time. Gloria's wrists throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs. She ignored it. She ignored the stares, the half-finished sentences dying on people's lips as she passed. She carried herself as if she had every right in the world to be there, because of course she did. That was the part they hated the most. At the front desk, the sergeant shifted nervously behind the counter, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Officer Miller lingered nearby, his shoulders hunched, looking like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew was coming. Walter didn't even glance at them. His attention was fixed solely on the desk phone, which had started ringing again. Sharp, insistent, demanding. The sergeant hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver as though it might bite him. "Answer it," Walter said quietly. The sergeant picked up the phone with trembling fingers. "Savannah PD," he croaked. He listened for maybe 2 seconds before his face turned a sickly shade of gray. His head bobbed quickly in a series of frantic nods. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He held the phone out toward Walter, his hand shaking. It's for you." Walter took the receiver with the calmness only a man who had seen it all could fake. His expression remained unchanged. He didn't bark into the phone. He didn't need to. "This is Tate," he said simply. There was a beat of silence. Then Walter's lips curled into a small, cold smile that sent a ripple through the room. "Good," he said into the receiver. "Proceed." He hung up without another word and handed the phone back to the stunned sergeant, as though it were nothing more than a prop in a play he was directing. Gloria raised an eyebrow, her voice low enough only Walter could hear. "What did you just set in motion?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He turned to her, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then, leaning in slightly, just enough that no one else could hear, he said, "You remember the civil rights unit I helped build before I retired?" he asked. "They've been looking for a case. The operation had concluded. The investigation was underway. But the real work, changing hearts, rebuilding trust, unlearning fear, would take years, perhaps even a lifetime. But she was still standing and she was still prepared." It was nearly midnight when Danielle found herself alone inside the quiet walls of the old municipal archive building downtown. She hadn't planned to stay so late, but something about the silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the rows of dusty case files, gave her a strange kind of comfort. The world outside was still loud, still burning with the aftermath of her actions, still debating her methods, still struggling to reconcile the fact that a black woman who once walked the streets as a nobody had brought down a wall that had stood for decades. But in here, there was only the truth. Paperwork, forgotten testimonies, cases shelved under bureaucracy, lives lost between the lines of what was documented and what was erased. Danielle had come searching for something that had haunted her for years. The original internal affairs report on her brother's incident. It had disappeared back then. No follow-up, no inquiry, no justice. But she believed now that it wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate, and she needed to see it with her own eyes. Her fingers moved carefully across the brittle tabs, tracing the years like they were scars. She pulled a box marked 2008, slid out the thick envelope labeled Use of Force, West Precinct, and flipped it open. Inside, among routine reports and vague statements, she found it, the page she had visualized 100 times in her memory. Jalen Brooks, date of incident, witness statements redacted, injuries consistent with blunt trauma, officers involved, Meeks, Daniels. Her throat tightened for a moment. Everything around her disappeared. All the noise, all the applause, all the anger gone. Just that page and the unbearable weight of knowing it had always been them. The men who had mocked her in court. The men who had called her garbage without knowing she was their reckoning in disguise. They hadn't just violated others. They had started with her family. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Moreno. Final DOJ statement comes out tomorrow morning. We need to prep. She replied simply, I'm ready. But deep down, she wasn't sure what readiness looked like anymore. She had been running on purpose for so long she hadn't stopped to ask herself what would be left when the mission ended. When the disguises were gone, the cameras faded, the reports written. Who was she then? Just a woman with too many truths and a city full of people still deciding whether to thank her or blame her. The next morning, Danielle stood in a long, high-ceilinged hall at the Justice Department, waiting to be called into a closed-door meeting with senior legal staff and federal prosecutors. Moreno stood beside her, briefcase in hand, his suit sharp but his expression weary. There's pushback, he said quietly. Some of the D.C. brass feel the operation compromised federal neutrality in community matters. They're worried you've become too visible. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Too visible for doing the job they gave me? Moreno gave a half-shrug, the kind that said more than words. This isn't about what's right. It's about what they can control. She exhaled, adjusting the collar of her jacket. Then let them try. I didn't come this far to apologize for forcing people to look. Inside the room, the tone was all cold professionalism. A row of officials sat across from her, folders in front of them, language carefully curated to sound fair but non-committal. They reviewed the data, asked procedural questions, brought up public reactions, federal liability, and departmental image. But one woman, Assistant Deputy Langston, leaned forward midway through the meeting and spoke in a voice that carried a different weight. Agent Brooks, I've read every page of your field notes, every recording, every transcript. And while some of my colleagues are nervous about the blowback, I want to say something plainly. What you did exposed something no audit, no task force, no annual review ever could. You didn't just pull back the curtain. You made people look into the mirror. Danielle met her gaze. That was the point. It always was. Langston nodded slowly, then turned to the rest of the board. Whatever else happens here today, let the record show that this agent demonstrated the courage our system claims to stand for. After the meeting, as the sun began to set behind the Washington skyline, Danielle returned to Baltimore for what would be the most emotional moment yet. Meeting the families. Not just those of recent victims, but the ones whose cases had never been opened, never received attention. Mothers, sons, grandfathers, sisters, all carrying pain wrapped in silence. The Bureau had organized the meeting as part of the department's effort to rebuild trust. But to Danielle, this wasn't policy. This was personal. The community center gym was filled with folding chairs and a heavy sense of anticipation. People looked at her, not with awe, but with expectation. She stood at the front, took the microphone, and paused. Then, with the raw honesty that had defined her journey, she spoke. I know some of you are still hurting. I know many of you are tired of speeches and promises. I'm not here to give you either. I'm here because I've seen what you've been living through. I felt it, and I came back to tell you not everything is fixed. Not yet, but the silence is broken, and that's where change begins. From the crowd, a woman stood, older, with a worn face and eyes that carried years of buried grief. My son was arrested 5 years ago. He never came home. They said it was an overdose, but I never got to see the report. Can you help me find the truth? Danielle's voice broke slightly as she replied, Yes, I will help you. I can't promise you justice overnight, but I can promise you won't be ignored again. After the gathering, as people filtered out with cautious hope, Danielle was approached by Officer Hall. He looked different. The same uniform, but a different presence, humble, purposeful. I submitted my resignation, he said quietly. But not because I'm quitting. I want to work from the outside, help rebuild what's broken. I owe you that. Danielle placed a hand on his shoulder. You owe that to yourself and to the people you serve. Coleman stopped pacing, his jaw working fiercely. This is being blown way out of proportion, he snapped, though no one in particular was listening. She resisted, she complicated things. No one responded, not even Miller, who didn't offer any support. Deep down, they all knew the truth. Gloria hadn't resisted, hadn't yelled, hadn't fought back. She had simply stood there, exhausted and dignified, while they shoved her into handcuffs and paraded her through a store full of onlookers as if she were a criminal. Now, every moment that passed, the evidence of that injustice was growing, videos being shared, posts going viral, eyewitness statements being collected. The story wasn't just confined to Savannah anymore. It was starting to spill out across the state, across the country. Another federal agent entered the station, a woman with sharp eyes and a tense jaw, carrying a black tablet under her arm. She didn't wait to be invited in, but crossed the floor with brisk, determined steps, speaking directly to the desk sergeant. We need access to all body cam footage from tonight, she said, her voice low but firm. Every second. No edits. No gaps. The sergeant hesitated, just a moment too long, his eyes narrowing. He fumbled for the login credentials, typing so fast he hit the wrong keys twice. Coleman's fists clenched at his sides as he watched. You can't just seize our footage without a warrant, he barked. The agent didn't even look at him. You waived that right the second you initiated an arrest without probable cause. Congratulations. Across the room, another agent was already plugging a small device into the station's main server, pulling up files faster than anyone could stop him. Miller made a small choked noise deep in his throat but remained where he was, trapped by the weight of his own cowardice. Coleman stepped forward, his voice rising. You don't know what you're dealing with here. The female agent turned, finally meeting his gaze. Oh, she said softly. We know exactly what we're dealing with. Her words hung in the air, sharp and cold. The murmuring among the officers grew louder, more frantic. Some were already texting, their thumbs flying over their phones, desperate for updates, desperate for instructions that weren't coming. The people who usually protected them, captains, unions, their old boy networks, had gone silent. They felt it too. The system wasn't circling the wagons this time. It was letting them hang. The internal phone started ringing again, more urgently now, but no one rushed to answer. Someone in the squad room cursed under his breath. Another officer dropped his coffee cup, the crash echoing like a gunshot. No one picked it up. The female agent pulled up a screen on her tablet and began scrolling through body cam footage. The footage of Gloria at the pharmacy played in silent, damning clarity. Gloria handing over her ID. Gloria calmly explaining herself. Gloria not resisting, not fighting, not doing anything that warranted handcuffs. And then there it was, Coleman sneering, mocking, manhandling. There it was, playing out frame by frame, no interpretation needed, no creative reports could fix this. The truth was right there for everyone to see. Coleman saw it too. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands twitching as if he didn't know whether to punch something or run. Miller just sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his face in his hands. The agent paused the video, tapping the screen. "This," she said simply, turning the tablet around to face the room. "This is what happens when you think no one's watching." No one spoke. No one moved. Gloria's voice echoed softly from the tablet, captured by the body cam microphone. Just one line. Calm and steady, even in the face of all that cruelty. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The agent smiled thinly. "Turns out," she said. She was right. Out in the lobby, the crowd was growing now. There were signs, chants. The press had started arriving too. Cameras flashing against the glass, microphones pressed against the door. The outside world was knocking, and for the first time in a long while, the people inside the station realized they might not be able to keep it out. The sergeant slumped behind the desk, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. One by one, the officers of Savannah PD realized they weren't just facing a bad night. They were facing judgment, real judgment, and it was only just beginning. The door swung open again, and this time, the atmosphere inside the station snapped so tight you could almost hear it crack. Walter Tate walked in as if he owned the building, and in a way, tonight he did. He didn't come alone. Flanking him were two high-ranking Department of Justice officials, their badges flashing under the fluorescent lights, their faces carved from stone. Behind them, another pair of federal agents carried heavy black cases, the kind that meant nothing good for whoever they were here to visit. Every officer in the room froze. Some stood up instinctively, old habits kicking in like soldiers at attention when a general enters the room. Others just stared wide-eyed, like they were witnessing something they couldn't quite process yet. Walter didn't say a word at first. He just let the moment stretch out, let them all feel it, the shift in power, the ground moving under their feet. He moved to the center of the room, his steps unhurried, his presence filling the space with a calm, lethal energy. The desk sergeant tried to stammer something, some half-formed protest, but Walter silenced him with just a look, a quiet, devastating look that said, "You had your chance. Now it's my turn." Officer Coleman stood near the back of the room, arms crossed tightly over his chest, chin jutted out in stubborn defiance. But even he couldn't quite hide the way his eyes kept darting to the federal badges, to the serious faces of the agents spreading out through the station. Walter finally broke the silence, his voice steady, low, but effortlessly carrying through the room. "My name is Walter Tate," he said, though half the room already knew him. Retired special agent in charge with the FBI, currently a consultant for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He let that sink in. "And as of 30 minutes ago," he continued, his tone razor-sharp, "this police station is under federal investigation for multiple violations of constitutional and civil rights." Miller let out a soft, strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Coleman shifted uneasily, trying to appear casual but failing miserably. Walter turned slowly, making eye contact with each officer in the room. His gaze cold, without anger, but with a certainty that felt even more unsettling. "We're here to ensure justice isn't just a word on a wall," he said. One of the DOJ officials stepped forward, pulling out a stack of papers from his briefcase. Effective immediately, the official announced, "Officers Rick Coleman and David Miller are suspended pending investigation into civil rights violations, wrongful arrests, and misconduct." The words landed like blows. Coleman opened his mouth to protest, but Walter cut him off with a single raised hand. "Save it," Walter said. "You'll get your chance to speak under oath." The agent handed over 2 sealed envelopes to the desk sergeant. Official notices of suspension. The sergeant took them with trembling hands. An agent approached Coleman and Miller, arms outstretched, collecting their badges and weapons. For a moment, it seemed as if Coleman might refuse. His chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides, and his eyes burned with fury. But there was nowhere left to run. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached up, unpinned his badge, and slammed it down on the desk so hard it rattled. Then he yanked his gun from its holster and set it beside the badge with a harsh metallic clatter. Miller followed, moving like a man walking toward his own execution. His badge came off with shaking fingers, and he set his weapon down almost gently, as if somehow he could salvage something from this mess. Walter watched them with the same expressionless calm. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There will be depositions, grand jury hearings, and when we're done—" He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle like a stone on everyone's chest. "If the evidence supports it," he continued, "there will be federal charges." Someone at the back of the station let out a low curse. No one shushed him, no one spoke at all. Outside, the noise was growing louder. The crowd had doubled, maybe tripled. Reporters jostled for position, camera flashes strobing against the dark windows. Protest signs bobbed up and down, a sea of anger, hope, and demands for justice. Walter nodded toward the front door. "You should understand something," he said, his voice quiet but deadly. "This isn't going away. When the cameras leave, this isn't a story that fades after a week." He looked directly at Coleman now, stripping him bare with his gaze. "You thought you could humiliate my daughter," he said. "You thought you could silence her. You thought you could push her into a system designed to chew her up and spit her out." Walter took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower, more dangerous. "You didn't just attack my family," he said. "You attacked every single person who's ever been told they don't belong, every person who's ever been treated like a criminal just for daring to exist." Coleman swallowed hard, his bravado slipping off him like a cheap coat in a storm. "And now," Walter finished, "you're going to find out what it feels like to answer for it." The DOJ officials moved in, escorting Coleman and Miller away. No handcuffs, not yet, but with a quiet finality that made it clear the handcuffs weren't far behind. Walter watched them go without satisfaction, without triumph. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. When they were gone, the remaining officers stood frozen, not daring to breathe too loudly. Walter turned to the desk sergeant. "You'll cooperate fully with this investigation," he said. "You'll turn over every piece of footage, every incident report, every disciplinary file. No redactions, no disappearing paperwork." The sergeant nodded mutely. Walter gave him one last look, almost pitying. "You might want to call a lawyer," he said. "You're going to need one." Then he turned and walked out of the station, the federal agents falling into step behind him. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as Gloria appeared beside him, stepping into the flashing lights and the roar of vindication. Walter didn't raise a hand, didn't smile for the cameras. He simply stood there, tall and unmovable, as the tide of justice surged around him. Tonight was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, it was a beginning built on truth, and there wasn't a single thing they could do to stop it. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the first headline hit: "Local police station under federal investigation for civil rights abuse." By noon, it wasn't just local news. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News. Gloria's arrest video was everywhere. Her face splashed across television screens and social media feeds, captured mid-frame, tired, dignified, and defiant. And right beside her name, in every headline, in every news cherin, "Retired FBI agent's daughter." The story caught fire because it wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about a system that had been rotten for too long. And this time, someone had finally forced the rot into the light. Inside the DOJ's Temporary Operations Center, a commandeered conference room just a few blocks from the Savannah PD station, agents worked around the clock. They pored over files, pulled body cam footage, subpoenaed internal emails, cross-referenced incident reports that suddenly looked very different under fresh scrutiny. Gloria sat quietly in a corner of the room, watching it unfold. Walter was there too, conferring quietly with the lead investigators. Every so often, he would glance over at Gloria, just to check in, a silent "Are you holding up?" She gave him the slightest nod. She was exhausted, deeply tired, but she wasn't backing down. The agents weren't just reviewing her case. They were delving into years of complaints filed against officers Coleman and Miller, and not only them. The deeper they searched, the more disturbing the findings became: 15 excessive force complaints, 7 allegations of racial profiling, and 3 internal affairs investigations, none of which had been properly closed, all buried under bureaucracy, all covered up by the same individuals who were supposed to hold them accountable. Emails surfaced, messages exchanged between supervisors mocking their tactics of intimidating troublemakers and maintaining the streets with outdated methods. Texts between Coleman and Miller bragging about violent arrests, screenshots of evidence tampering, chain of custody violations, even cases where body cam footage had mysteriously disappeared. But it wasn't missing now. Someone smarter, or perhaps just angrier, had saved backup copies, and now every damning second was being played out on 100 monitors, observed by agents who scribbled notes with cold detachment, knowing this would end careers. One clip in particular made Gloria's stomach churn. A black teenager, no older than 16, pinned face first against the hood of a patrol car, crying as Coleman shouted insults at him. No crime, no justification, just pure rage and cruelty backed by a badge. Another clip showed Miller laughing while shoving a Latina woman into the back of a squad car during a routine traffic stop. She hadn't been cited for anything. She'd simply asked why she'd been pulled over. Each video eroded any defense the department might have thought they could build. There would be no spinning this, no plausible deniability, no sweeping it under the rug. Walter stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He didn't look victorious. He looked furious, controlled fury, the kind that burns slowly and lasts a lifetime. The lead DOJ agent, Special Agent Ramirez, finally turned to Gloria. Her voice was calm but held the authority of someone who had made her decision. "We have enough to recommend criminal charges," Ramirez said. "Not just misconduct, not just civil suits." She ticked off the charges on her fingers. Obstruction of justice, falsifying police reports, tampering with evidence, deprivation of rights under color of law. She paused. "And that's just the beginning." Walter nodded once, grimly satisfied. "Good." Gloria said nothing, just sat there, absorbing it all, because this wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about the teenager pinned against the car, the woman shoved into the squad car, the countless others who hadn't been fortunate enough to have a Walter Tate waiting in the wings. Outside the window, news vans lined the street. Protesters waved signs. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform. The city was awake now, angry. The phone on the conference table buzzed sharply. Agent Ramirez picked it up, listened for a moment, then covered the receiver with her hand, looking at Walter. "Internal Affairs just placed the chief of police on administrative leave," she said. Walter raised an eyebrow. "Voluntarily?" Ramirez smirked, a rare flicker of humor in the grim room. "Not exactly. He got a call from the Attorney General's office. They strongly suggested it." Walter gave a dry chuckle. "Guess he finally realized which way the wind was blowing." Ramirez nodded and turned back to the phone. Gloria leaned back, letting the noise of the room wash over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel it, the tidal shift happening around her. She thought back to that first moment in the pharmacy, the way the manager had looked at her like she didn't belong, the way Coleman had grabbed her, sneered at her, treated her like she was disposable. And now the world saw it too. Now the world cared. Another agent approached, dropping a thick file on the table in front of Ramirez. "Financials," he said shortly. "We followed the money trail. Civil asset forfeiture abuses. Off-the-books bonuses for officers with the highest street stops." Gloria's stomach twisted tighter. They weren't just bullies, they were predators built into the system, rewarded for it. Ramirez flipped through the documents quickly, then set them down with grim finality. "This," she said, "is systemic corruption." Walter didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded because he already knew. He had always known. It was why he had fought so hard, even long after retirement. It was why he hadn't hesitated when Gloria called him. Because this wasn't just a bad department. It was a disease, and it was time to cut it out. The agents continued filing evidence, preparing the formal charges. Plans were being made to expand the investigation. Other precincts, other cases, other cities. This was just the beginning. Gloria stood up slowly, her body still stiff from the long night. Walter turned to her, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You ready for the next part?" he asked. Gloria met his gaze, steady and sure. I was born ready, she said, and she meant it. The news broke faster than anyone could control. By the time Gloria and Walter walked into the press conference that afternoon, the room was already packed. Wall-to-wall reporters crammed into every available inch of space. Cameras stacked 3 deep, microphones pointed like weapons toward the podium at the front. The mayor of Savannah stood behind it, pale and stiff, like a man attending his own funeral. Beside him, the interim police chief, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days, clutched a thick file of prepared statements and talking points, all of which felt useless by now. Walter and Gloria took their seats quietly near the front, surrounded by federal agents and DOJ officials who flanked them like sentinels. The mayor cleared his throat into the microphone. The sound was sharp and jarring in the heavy silence. Today, he began, his voice shaky, we are announcing sweeping changes in response to the findings uncovered by the Department of Justice's investigation. He paused, glancing sideways at the federal agents. The operation was over. The investigation was in motion. But the real work, changing hearts, rebuilding trust, unlearning fear, would take years, maybe even a lifetime. Yet she was still standing and she was still ready. It was almost midnight when Gloria found herself alone inside the silent, aged walls of the old municipal archive building downtown. She hadn't meant to stay this late, but there was something about the stillness, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the rows of forgotten case files that offered a peculiar comfort. The world outside was still loud, still burning with the aftermath of her actions, still debating her methods, still trying to make sense of the fact that a black woman who once walked the streets unnoticed had brought down a wall that had been standing for decades. But in here, there was only the truth. Paperwork, forgotten testimonies, cases buried under bureaucracy, lives lost between what had been documented and what had been erased. Gloria had come looking for something that had haunted her for years. The original Internal Affairs report on her brother's incident. It had vanished back then. No follow-up.
No inquiry.
No justice. But now, she believed it wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate. And she needed to see it for herself. Her fingers moved carefully over the brittle tabs, tracing the years as though they were scars. She pulled out a box marked 2008, slid out the thick envelope labeled Use of Force, West Precinct, and opened it. Inside, among routine reports and vague statements, she found it. The page she'd envisioned 100 times in her mind. Jalen Brooks, date of incident. Witness statements redacted. Injuries consistent with blunt trauma. Officers involved, Meeks, Daniels. Her throat tightened for a moment. Everything around her faded. All the noise, all the applause, all the anger gone. Just that page and the unbearable weight of knowing it had always been them. The men who had mocked her in court. The men who had called her worthless without knowing she was their reckoning in disguise. They hadn't just wronged others. They had begun with her family. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Moreno. Final DOJ statement comes out tomorrow morning. We need to prep. She replied simply, I'm ready. But deep down, she wasn't sure what readiness looked like anymore. She had been driven by purpose for so long that she hadn't stopped to ask herself what would be left when the mission ended. When the disguises were gone, the cameras faded, and the reports were written. Who was she then? Just a woman with too many truths and a city full of people still deciding whether to thank her or blame her. The next morning, Gloria stood in a long, high-ceilinged hall at the Justice Department, waiting to be called into a closed-door meeting with senior legal staff and federal prosecutors. Moreno stood beside her, briefcase in hand, his suit sharp but his expression worn. There's pushback, he said quietly. Some of the DC brass feel the operation compromised federal neutrality in community matters. They're worried you've become too visible. Gloria raised an eyebrow. Too visible for doing the job they gave me? Moreno gave a half shrug, the kind that said more than words. This isn't about what's right. It's about what they can control. She exhaled, adjusting the collar of her jacket. Then let them try. I didn't come this far to apologize for forcing people to look. Inside the room, the tone was all cold professionalism. A row of officials sat across from her, folders in front of them, language carefully curated to sound fair but non-committal. They reviewed the data, asked procedural questions, brought up public reactions, federal liability, and departmental image. But one woman, Assistant Deputy Langston, leaned forward midway through the meeting and spoke in a voice that carried a different weight. "Agent Brooks, I've read every page of your field notes, every recording, every transcript. And while some of my colleagues are nervous about the blowback, I want to say something plainly. What you did exposed something no audit, no task force, no annual review ever could. You didn't just pull back the curtain. You made people look into the mirror." Gloria met her gaze. "That was the point. It always was." Langston nodded slowly, then turned to the rest of the board. "Whatever else happens here today, let the record show that this agent demonstrated the courage our system claims to stand for." After the meeting, as the sun began to dip behind the Washington skyline, Gloria returned to Baltimore for what would be the most emotional moment yet: meeting the families. Not just those of recent victims, but the ones whose cases had never been opened, never received attention. Mothers, sons, grandfathers, sisters, all carrying pain wrapped in silence. The Bureau had organized the meeting as part of the department's effort to rebuild trust. But for Gloria, this wasn't policy. This was personal. The community center gym was filled with folding chairs and a heavy sense of anticipation. People looked at her, not with awe, but with expectation. She stood at the front, took the microphone, and paused. Then, with the raw honesty that had defined her journey, she spoke. "I know some of you are still hurting. I know many of you are tired of speeches and promises. I'm not here to give you either. I'm here because I've seen what you've been living through. I felt it, and I came back to tell you not everything is fixed. Not yet, but the silence is broken, and that's where change begins." From the crowd, a woman stood, older, with a worn face and eyes that carried years of buried grief. "My son was arrested 5 years ago. He never came home. They said it was an overdose, but I never got to see the report. Can you help me find the truth?" Gloria's voice broke slightly as she replied, "Yes, I will help you. I can't promise you justice overnight, but I can promise you won't be ignored again." After the gathering, as people filtered out with cautious hope, Gloria was approached by Officer Hall. He looked different, the same uniform but a different presence. Humble, purposeful. "I submitted my resignation," he said quietly. "But not because I'm quitting. I want to work from the outside, help rebuild what's broken. I owe you that." Gloria placed a hand on his shoulder. "You owe that to yourself and to the people you serve." A few civil rights attorneys exchanged long, serious phone calls. A few emails passed between individuals who typically didn't trust each other, but now realized they shared the same bruises, the same anger burning inside. Then it began to grow. One former victim came forward, then another and another. Men, women, teenagers, senior citizens, each of them had stories. Some old, some new, all woven from the same fabric of humiliation, brutality, and silence. Gloria attended the first meeting almost by chance. Walter had received a call from an old colleague, a civil rights attorney named Marcus Dean, asking if they would come listen, not to speak, just to listen. And so they did. They sat in the back of a rented church hall, the metal chairs cold and uncomfortable, and listened as one person after another stood up and shared their story. A young black man wrongfully arrested for matching a description while jogging. A Latina mother forcibly removed from her car at gunpoint during a routine taillight stop. An elderly man beaten during a late-night welfare check that turned violent without cause. The stories poured out, raw and unfiltered, and Gloria felt something settle deep in her chest. A heavy, aching kind of fury that had nothing to do with her own experience and everything to do with the system that had allowed all of this to happen. Walter sat next to her, stone-faced, arms folded tightly across his chest, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped a silent rhythm against his bicep. He was taking it all in, every word, every injustice. When Marcus Dean finally stood up at the front of the room went silent. He didn't yell, he didn't shout, he simply spoke plainly. "We have an opportunity here," he said. We have evidence, we have witnesses, and most importantly, we have momentum. He paused, letting that sink in. We can file a class action lawsuit against the city, the police department, and every officer implicated. We can drag every ugly truth into the light where it belongs. The room buzzed with low, anxious murmurs. Some people looked scared, some skeptical. A few nodded, their eyes burning with resolve. Marcus's gaze found Gloria where she sat at the back. But we can't do it without someone willing to stand at the front, he said. Someone the public already knows, someone they believe in. Gloria felt every head in the room turn toward her. The weight of it hit hard, sudden and undeniable. For a moment, she wanted to shrink away, to let someone else carry the load this time. But then she thought about that metal bench in the holding cell, the cuffs cutting into her wrists, the cold look in Officer Coleman's eyes, the trembling hands of the teenager pinned against the car, the silent sobs of the woman shoved into the back seat, the haunted faces filling the room. She stood up slowly, and the room went dead silent. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. And that was it. The lawsuit moved faster than anyone expected. Within a month, the legal team filed official paperwork. Dozens of plaintiffs listed, hundreds of pages of documented abuses, and a clear demand for accountability, reparations, and federal oversight. The city tried to push back at first. They hired expensive lawyers, issued carefully worded statements denying systemic problems. They threw around terms like isolated incidents and miscommunications. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, the public pressure was relentless, and the national media attention made it impossible to sweep anything under the rug. One by one, cracks appeared in the city's defenses. First came the resignation of the police chief. Quietly, in the dead of night, with no press conference, no farewell parade. Then came the suspension of half a dozen senior officers tied to the buried complaints. And finally, inevitably, the mayor himself announced he wouldn't seek re-election, citing health reasons. No one believed it for a second. But it didn't stop there. Walter and Gloria watched as other cities started reaching out, community organizers, civil rights groups, even whistleblowers inside other departments. They wanted advice, they wanted help, they wanted to know how Savannah had done it. Because what had started as one arrest, one injustice, had become a blueprint, a roadmap for dismantling corruption from the inside out. One evening, Gloria sat with Walter on the back porch of her modest little house, the crickets chirping in the warm Georgia air. The sky was painted deep purple and gold, the last scraps of sunlight fading over the horizon. She sipped her sweet tea slowly, letting the quiet settle over them. "You ever think we'd see something like this?" she asked. Walter chuckled low in his throat. "Not in my lifetime," he admitted. "Hell, not even in my dreams some days." They sat for a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one. Finally, Gloria spoke again. "It's not over, is it?" Walter shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It never is. There will always be another fight, another battle." He looked at her then, his eyes fierce and proud. "But you made them see. You made them care." Gloria smiled, a real one this time. Tired, yes, but full of something deeper, something stronger, hope. Not the blind, naive kind, but the hard-earned kind that only grows after you've fought through the worst of it and come out the other side still standing. Inside the house, her phone buzzed with another message. Another reporter wanting an interview, another civil rights leader wanting her to speak at a rally. Gloria let it buzz. For tonight, she just wanted to sit here under the stars with her father at her side. She would pick up the fight again tomorrow, because now she understood something she hadn't known before. The real power wasn't in one lawsuit. It wasn't even in bringing down corrupt officers or exposing a broken system. The real power was in refusing to be silent, in standing up, in being seen. And no matter how many battles lay ahead, Gloria Tate was ready. Because once you start telling the truth, you don't go back. 6 months later, Savannah was a different city. Protests had faded into the past, but the changes they prompted remained. New leadership at the police department, new policies, new faces walking the halls where old ghosts once lingered. For the first time in a long while, people in the community started to believe, even if just a little, that maybe things could be different, that perhaps this time change would endure. Gloria stood at the back of the federal courthouse, observing the final moments of the trial unfold. The polished floors shone beneath the fluorescent lights, and the air inside was thick with anticipation, making each breath feel heavier. At the defense table, Rick Coleman and David Miller sat rigidly, their suits wrinkled and their faces pale. Gone were the smug smirks and swagger. They now appeared smaller, diminished, not by the trial itself, but by the undeniable truth that had finally caught up to them. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. Gloria watched, unblinking, as the foreman rose, holding the verdict slip in trembling hands. On the charges of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charges of falsifying police reports, guilty. On the charges of unlawful arrest and deprivation of civil rights, guilty, guilty, guilty. The words echoed in the heavy silence, bouncing off the marble walls and settling like dust in the corners of the room. Coleman slumped forward, his head in his hands. Miller simply stared ahead, his eyes hollow. Neither of them dared to look at Gloria. The judge thanked the jury and adjourned the court. People began to stir, gathering their papers, whispering among themselves, but Gloria remained rooted to the spot, letting it all wash over her. She didn't feel triumphant, nor did she feel vengeful. What she mostly felt was tired, but it was the kind of tired that comes after a long, brutal fight, knowing she had left everything on the field. Walter gently touched her elbow, pulling her back to the present. "Ready to go home?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Gloria nodded. They walked out of the courthouse together, past the reporters shouting questions, past the flashing cameras, past the curious onlookers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman who had become a symbol of something bigger than herself. Outside, the air was cool and sweet, touched with the first hints of spring. Azaleas bloomed along the sidewalks, their bright colors defiant against the backdrop of old brick buildings. Gloria took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh, heavy air. Freedom smelled different today. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Marcus Dean was waiting for them, his briefcase slung over one shoulder and a wide smile on his face. "You did it," he said simply. Gloria shook her head. "We did it." Walter slapped Marcus on the back, and the three of them stood there for a moment, savoring it. Savoring the fact that, for once, the system had cracked. Even if it hadn't shattered completely, a crack was enough to begin the change. Walter's phone buzzed with another call. Another community leader, another request for advice, for guidance. He silenced it with a swipe of his thumb and slipped it back into his pocket. Today wasn't about work. Today was about breathing. They decided to skip the press conferences and interviews. Instead, they drove to Gloria's favorite little diner on the outskirts of town, a place with peeling vinyl booths and the best peach cobbler for miles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. Over greasy burgers and sweet tea, they talked about everything except the case. About Walter's stubborn tomato plants that refused to grow, about Marcus's daughter getting accepted to college, about Gloria's dream of finally taking that long-delayed vacation somewhere she didn't have to be strong every second of the day, somewhere she could just be. After lunch, Walter dropped Gloria off at her house. She stood on the porch for a long time after he drove away, staring out at the quiet street. The kids riding bikes, the elderly couple walking their dog, the world just moving on. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe she could have a life beyond survival. Inside, she kicked off her shoes, padded barefoot into the living room, and collapsed onto the couch with a sigh that came from the depths of her being. Her phone buzzed again. She checked it. Another request to speak at a rally, another interview offer. Gloria smiled faintly and set the phone face down on the coffee table. Not today. Today, she wasn't a symbol. Today, she wasn't a fighter. Today, she was just Gloria, the woman who had been humiliated in a pharmacy, thrown into a cell, dragged through the mud, and stood back up anyway. The woman who had refused to let them define her. The woman who had reminded a city, and maybe a country, that dignity isn't something anyone else can give you. It's something you carry inside, even when the world tries to rip it away. She closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant laughter of kids playing down the street. She had won. Not because the system suddenly became perfect, not because the fight was over, but because she was still here, still standing, still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, inspiring others to do the same. The road ahead would still be difficult. There would be more battles, more nights when the weight of it all would feel too much to bear. But Gloria Tate knew something now that could never be taken away. She was more than what they had done to her. She was more than their assumptions, their handcuffs, their small, mean imaginations. She was free not because they said so, but because she said so. And that, in the end, was the only justice that truly mattered. When we look back at Gloria's story, it's easy to see it as a personal victory, but it's so much bigger than that. It's a reminder that injustice can exist anywhere, sometimes hidden right under our noses, and that it takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand tall, even when everything seems stacked against you, to change it. This isn't just about one arrest. It's about every moment someone was treated like they didn't belong, every time a voice was silenced, every injustice swept under the rug because no one thought they could make a difference. Gloria's fight shows us that standing up matters, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how long it takes. And it's a lesson we can all carry into our own lives, whether it's speaking up for a neighbor, fighting for what's right in our communities, or teaching the next generation that dignity and respect are not negotiable. So, if this story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shine a light on truth, resilience, and the kind of everyday courage that changes the world, one stand at a time. Because together, when we choose not to look away, when we stand up instead of standing by, we are stronger than we ever could be alone.